Welcome to this evening's meeting of Scrutiny Panel. To all our guests in our virtual meeting room and to everyone watching online, I'm Councillor Margaret Gordon, Chair of Scrutiny Panel. Just a few housekeeping points. This meeting is being recorded and live streamed now. Please can you all keep your microphones on mute throughout the meeting. This will prevent audio feedback. If you're still getting feedback, please turn off nearby devices. If you'd like to speak, raise your hand to get my attention, state your name and affiliation before you make a comment. For anyone attending virtually, the chat function must not be used to have conversations with other participants or to provide personal information. All chats recorded, as is a formal meeting. Please don't use the chat function to alert me you wish to speak or to raise points of order or tech problems. Officers will assist you. So this is a formal meeting of Hackney Council. Please note the press may be in attendance. The rights of press and public to record and film the meeting will apply. So we'll now move on to agenda item 1, apologies for absence. I've had Councillor Polly Billington and Councillor Anna Lynch, who are attending as the Chair of Audit, and attending virtually, I've got Councillor Claire Joseph, and I'm also expecting Councillor Ben Hayhurst is here, so I wasn't looking at that. And thank you for Dawn Carter-MacDonald and Louise Humphreys attending virtually, and also Councillor Chapman. Are there any other apologies? No. Agenda item 2, urgent items. Haven't been notified of anything? Nope. So agenda item 3, declarations of interests. I'm asking members to declare any interests. Has anyone got any interest to declare? I can't see anyone. Here's Councillor Adjare. So just invite you to declare any interests if you have any.
Oh, no.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So, okay, so just let Councillor Adjare get settled, and then we're moving on to our first substantive item, which is item number 4, the Constitution update, review of the overview and scrutiny sections. So the Council's Constitution Committee is currently reviewing the Constitution to consider if the current information serves its function in being clear for the public and members about the operation of the Council and its decision-making processes. In the Constitution, there are 3 sections relevant to overview and scrutiny. So the purpose of this item is to discuss and collate suggestions and views from Scrutiny Panel to present to the Constitutional Committee for consideration as part of the review work. So just to emphasise that we'll be feeding into the Constitutional Committee with our views and suggestions. We're not going to be making decisions tonight. So you've had various background items provided, the draft index of the Council's Constitution, Article 7 from Part 2, Part 4 of the Constitution, the overview and scrutiny procedure rules, and Part 4 of the Constitution, the call-in procedures. There's various primary legislation underpinning the overview and scrutiny, so some provisions come from there and other provisions are obviously specific to Hackney. So I'd like to welcome to the meeting for the discussion Dawn Carter-MacDonald, Director of Legal, Democratic and Electoral Services, and Louise Humphreys, the Head of Legal and Governance. I'd now invite either Dawn or Louise or both to give a quick introduction. You have up to 5 minutes. I don't know who wants to speak first.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening to everyone. Yes, so we would like to do a short introduction as you have just outlined, and I'm going to ask Louise to do that for us. Just to say very quickly, however, that this piece of work is something that we are taking really seriously. It's a very important piece of work for the Council, and also it's something that we've embarked on because as part of manifesto commitments, there was the commitment that the Constitution would be accessible, would be made accessible to residents and to, in fact, to anyone who needs to use it and would like to use it. And so therefore we have undertaken this piece of work with officers who are working in the background, as it were, but then also liaising with the Constitution Committee members to ensure that there's transparency, to ensure that the final document that is produced is one which everyone will find accessible, and also be able to see how the council operates, makes its decisions, and does what it needs to do. But I'll ask Louise to continue and to do a further introduction on the piece of work that we're doing. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dawn. And Louise, you could just going to frame the discussion a little bit further. We've probably got about 3.5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gordon. So I won't go over anything that Dawn has already mentioned. Again, just to summarise, the aims of the review work are to provide greater clarity and improve upon the information that public business and other organisations has with regard to how we as a council operate, with particular reference to our decision-making processes and how they can get involved in those processes as appropriate. We are, as part of our review, adopting the principles of plain English where we can do so, to try and avoid jargon and certainly legalese. So we are adopting those principles. You've already referenced the Constitution Committee. That committee was established in January 2022 and currently comprises, we have one member from the executive, and they're responsible for reporting views of the executive. We have yourself from the scrutiny side. We have a member from our audit committee. We have one member from each of our opposition groups so that we can take views from across all political parties. And then we have a member from the majority group who isn't a member of the executive, and they're responsible then for reporting into us views from the majority group. So we have a broad political spectrum on that Constitution Committee and a broad range of views from the various decision-making, overview and scrutiny side, and then audit element as well. And as Dawn mentioned, we have a Constitution Officer Working Group made up of officers from legal and governance. So what this review is not doing, it is not changing how the council operates. We're not proposing substantive changes to our various committees. We understand that there may be some proposals to make some minor changes, and that may be naming. But in terms of the substantive method by which they operate, that's not the purpose of this review, and nor is it seeking to amend issues around balance of power. It is purely there around clarity and public accessibility. The way in which the process works is generally that the officer working group review a part of the Constitution. We put forward proposed amendments to wording around clarity and accessibility. Those are then considered by the Constitution Committee, and we have a discussion around those. And we take away comments and questions where we can seek to make further improvements. And then we go back around this process. So that the timetable that we're currently working to is for the revised Constitution to be adopted by full council in July of this year. And that will be preceded by a short period of public engagement. And we're working with our consultation team around framing the scope of that engagement. So we are on a very tight timetable. We think it's achievable, but it is a very tight time frame that we have to work. So that's all I wanted to say by way of introduction. And then obviously, as has been foreshadowed, you have the three elements of overview and scrutiny specific. There are obviously other references in the Constitution to overview and scrutiny, but the specific parts. And you'll see that what we are proposing to do is extract the call-in procedure rules, which are currently embedded within the overview and scrutiny procedure rules, and actually have a standalone document that deals with call-in, because we actually think that would be more useful for councillors to be able to find that information rather than having to go through a raft of overview and scrutiny procedure rules and attempt to locate it. So that's the type of changes we are doing around ease and accessibility. And then we've also attempted in the document you have before you this evening to provide more information, greater clarity about how then those call-ins would work, because at the moment the information within the Constitution is quite limited. So we hope that that will be an improvement. But as always, this is the purpose of these discussions. You know, we don't have that many call-ins, but I'm sure most of you will have experienced a call-in. So it's useful to take your input as to how you think it works, you know, the processes that do work, don't work, and how we can refine them to try and make that better. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Louise and Dawn, for those really helpful introductions. So, as people will appreciate, we've got limited time. I'm just going to quickly welcome 3 other people who've come in since I started welcoming people. So Councillor Binny Lovack, who's also on the Constitutional Committee, Councillor Garbett, thanks for coming tonight, and also Councillor Troughton, who's on the Constitutional Committee with me, and Councillor Binny Lovack. Thank you as well for coming. So we're obviously not going to be able to get through everything in these documents, so I'm not proposing to go through anything line by line. So I've just got, I'm just going to make a few remarks of the sort of things I would like people to sort of focus on. I'd also want a contribution from everyone in panel, if possible, just so we can get your views. There'll also be subsequent opportunities in writing. I mean, I think really what in general we should be looking for from our constitution, obviously sort of bearing in mind that this isn't a review of the way that the scrutiny function, you know, operates, or, you know, its overall structure. But I think we should be looking really about how well it sort of serves us in terms of making our scrutiny function accessible to the public, so that the public, you know, so it's open and accessible, and the public know how to find us and how to communicate with us. And in addition, I think we maybe need to think about how it helps us work collaboratively, which I think is a, you know, an ambition of all the scrutiny leads in this room. I'm also going to acknowledge as well that, I mean, obviously there's a vacant position as Vice Chair of Scrutiny Panel, which has been reserved for the main opposition group. They haven't taken it up since this was established for 6 years now. I notice there's no one from the main opposition group here this evening. There's obviously 2 people from the second opposition group. So I'm going to really sort of acknowledge that as well, because that is something that we may want to have some discussion about. Although obviously bearing in mind what Louise says is that this forum isn't about making major structural changes of that type. I'm now going to invite contributions. I've got Councillor Hayhurst. I am aware that Councillor Garbett needs to go. Is it at 7:30? 7:40. Okay, well, I'll certainly bear that in mind and make sure that you get an opportunity to speak before then. So I'm going to start with Councillor Hayhurst, and then if anyone else wants to come in. Councillor Hayhurst.
Thanks, Chair.
Actually, Councillor Hayhurst, I do apologise. I was going to invite, after you've come in, I was going to invite Tracy to actually highlight some issues that the scrutiny leads have noticed in the Constitution they'd also like us to consider.
Cool. Okay. Thanks, Chair. Just welcome this. Agree that the call-in procedure taken out as a separate item would be very helpful in terms of transparency and accountability. And I suppose a lot of what Louise was just talking about, really, as well as the language, might come down to the presentation, and in fact how it's then presented on the council website. And I can sort of in my head think of quite exciting ways that for a constitution it can sort of be much more accessible in terms of sort of like areas that are understandable for residents to be able to go into. So in reality, I think a lot of the what we're seeking to achieve here will be done on the presentation end, possibly the way it's presented on the website in reality for people. So I would sort of suggest or support that is really where the focus is on this in a way, and that could, if the goal is to assist residents and support accountability, transparency, that's really going to be the main vehicle to achieve it. Can I just ask one sort of cheeky health question, just to confirm my own understanding from this, from just the pre-reading, so it's not sort of technically on point in terms of the any revisions. In terms of health in Hackney, the formal powers rarely used, but if we did want to refer to the Secretary of State, I was always under the impression that originally was given to full council, and then in Hackney they delegated that to health in Hackney. But something I read on the pre-reading possibly made me think that wasn't the case. So could either of you, it maybe you need to come back to me on that, but I just wanted, just so I know for my own understanding, what is the formal council position on the health in Hackney's regulatory position on referring to the Secretary of State? Do we have the power as health in Hackney, or is that a full council power at the moment?
So thank you for your comments, Councillor Hayhurst, and also your observations. That is something that we would have to come back to you on. I wouldn't want to answer that straight away without properly checking that. So we will endeavour to do that as quickly as possible, and then feedback through Tracy the response and the full answer to that.
Okay,
Thanks very much.
so you know, there was something in the pre-read which sort of indicated that
it
was delegated to health in Hackney, who then referred it to full council. I actually think it's the other way
round. Okay.
That actually the council have delegated it to us, and I'd always be under the assumption that we hold that power, albeit used appropriately. But I just wanted, just to check.
Yeah.
It would be really good to clarify where that power lies.
Yes.
Thank you, Councillor Hayhurst. So I'm now going to bring in Tracy, if that's okay, because she's just going to highlight a few provisions that the officers wanted us to consider, and then Councillor Potter.
Okay, just in reference to point 18 under the overview and scrutiny procedure rules on page 23 in the agenda, it's a reference that it makes to informing the monitoring officer about for any attendance of councillors or senior officers that are required to attend a scrutiny commission. Currently what we do is we just go directly to the councillor or the officers and give them the notice. Everything in here we do, but we don't do it via the monitoring officer. So we're just flagging that as maybe something if the monitoring officer gets taken out of that.
Could I just quickly come in on that? I mean, I think that should probably be redrafted so it's a check and balance rather than a formal part of the procedure. I think that would be more proportionate. Is my contribution to that. Sorry, Tracy, I don't with
and the second one I wanted to refer to was the under the call-in, it's point 3.1, and you've got it's asking for the number of days, and you've just got an X there. Are you asking us to kind of comment on the number of days that you'd like us to specify for a decision to be published, or is this something that will be put in through the Constitutional Committee when they decide on a timeline?
Dawn or Louise, do you want to come in with that, on that? Or you can come back to us if you don't have it.
It's not, in relation to the point about 3.1, the reason the X is there is for us to carry out a check to ensure, obviously, that where we are publishing decisions taken by Cabinet, that the process that is adopted, because we do publish them normally, and it's normally within 24 hours, but it sometimes is slightly longer, when the decisions notices are actually formally published. We just want to we left it as an X days to make sure that if we're going to say that it's published within X days, obviously A, that's achievable, and B, then also that further cross-reference, if there's any statutory requirement about publication, that it's meeting any statutory requirement. Hence why it is an X at the moment, but it will be a factual date that is inputted by the Constitution Officer Working Group. It's not something that in essence is controlled by on the scrutiny side. The decisions that are reached are published by the governance team, and it is that date from which the call-in period will run for the 5 days. And the 5 days is a statutory time frame.
Okay. And just a couple of other quick ones from me, which is I'm suggesting to Scrutiny Panel, if we want to think about changing our name from Scrutiny Commissions to Scrutiny Committee. This is just really in light of the commissions being set up by the exec and there may be confusion with the public when they start to report and they're doing their work, that they think it's all under scrutiny commissions when it's not. So maybe we would think about changing our reference to scrutiny committees. And the last one for me is about changing the name of Living in Hackney to Climate Homes and Environment, or maybe members have some other suggestion, but whether you'd like to take this opportunity to consider a name change as well.
Thank you very much, Tracy. I think I'd be in favour of both those last proposals, but obviously other members want to come in. I'm going to bring in Councillor Potter, and then I'm going to give Councillor Garbett, because I appreciate you're going to have to go, an opportunity, and then I do want to make sure that all members get an opportunity to contribute. And Councillor Potter, you had your hand up.
Microphone.
I still forget. Yeah, I also support those changes to committee and also the change of name. But obviously, I'd like to hear, first of all, some feedback from both the former chair, Living in Hackney, and the current chair of Living in Hackney. I think they may quite strong views on that. My comment was about the brief for skills economy and growth. And when we've looked at our area, discussed what we can look at in terms of large schemes and economic regeneration, obviously the implication of that is housing and homes, and that's Living in Hackney. I wondered whether we can have a bit more of an explanation of when our briefs cross different committees and how that can be looked at together, because I think we haven't explored some of our areas sufficiently, because, you know, the guidance hasn't been clear when briefs cross, because you can't look at large schemes without including housing. You know, but that comes very much on the skills of economy and growth. So I think some more guidance when committee briefs cross would be very useful for sessions committees.
Thanks very much, Councillor Potter. I can see that Councillor Joseph has got her hand up. I'm just going to bring in Councillor Garbett first. I don't know whether Councillor Binny Lovett wants to speak as well at the same time, but it's no more than 5 minutes. So because we've also got quite a few other.
No, it's fine. I won't be too long. So yeah, really appreciate being invited. And I know the importance of scrutiny, and we do operate kind of in a non-political way in scrutiny. So I know we're being invited as the opposition, but very much participate in that way. I've got two comments, but I'll go with the second one first, just because it's linking to what's being said about the climate, because reading the briefs currently, the climate's completely missing. It's not like a theme through. And when we started and reviewed the kind of survey feedback last year, we said that it would kind of be across the commissions or committees. So I think that needs to be a lot stronger, just in the narrative, in line with obviously our climate emergency kind of commitments. And obviously, yeah, we'll be interested to hear what the Living in Hackney chair and previous chairs were saying. But I think I quite like the fact it's called Living in Hackney, but I know that probably doesn't speak to maybe what residents perceive it as, because I think you obviously wouldn't want to lose the element of, yeah, so I'm a member of Living in Hackney, but the policing element. I don't know what you said. Did you say climate homes and environments? Yeah, it loses. I think it's really important that the police, and it's really key that people know that that's where we're scrutinising the police. But I don't have an answer to what that would. I'd have to keep thinking about that. I don't know if, yeah, Soraya's got a comment on that. But I can have a think about what that looks like. And then just on the bit that you mentioned earlier, Chair, around how residents can participate, and I think that's really important. So obviously there's the survey, obviously I've only witnessed this once, but the survey that took place earlier in the year, and I don't know if there's more that we can do to kind of push that out, but then show residents how their feedback was taken on and what we did with it, so they know that it's kind of, yeah, worth feeding in, and just maybe doing more to publicise what we've done in the committees and how it's made it, and how it's made a difference, and how we talk about that, like in our commissions, and then how we talk about how we're going to communicate that out. But yeah, that's just some reflections from the last year. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Garb. I don't know, Councillor Binny Lovett, whether you want to quickly come in, and then I'll bring in Councillor Joseph and then Councillor Patrick. No, thank you. You've had plenty of opportunities on the Constitution. So Councillor Joseph, he's online. Do you want to come in now? Thank you. Joseph, are you?
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, perfect. Thank
Can you hear me?
you. Seem to be breaking up a bit, I'm
Thank you.
afraid.
Sorry. So just in response to the suggested change.
Do you want to turn your camera off
living
for a
in
minute? Because I seem to be breaking up. See if that's any better.
need to climb at homes.
I'm really sorry, Councillor Joseph. I can't hear
I
you
was
at the
also
moment.
gonna
I think
make
I'll
that
bring somebody else in and
point
just
about
see if you can come in a
including-
minute. Sorry about that.
Yeah, it's on the issue of crime and disorder. I don't know whether we can tighten up the role of the Scrutiny Commission to actually call in the police. I seem to remember when I was chair, there was some dispute about who the police were responsible to, although they did come to living in Hackney when we asked them to, but I seem to remember they didn't actually have to come. I mean, yeah, they would look pretty silly perhaps not to come, but I do wonder whether it's in our power to suggest that the police come, or whether it's somebody else's power to insist that the police come if they were asked and provide adequate responses. Because I do think it's very important as the crime committee that we do hold our local police force to account.
Thank you. I think Tracy wants to come in, and then Councillor Maggiore and Councillor Potter.
So, Councillor Patch, just to respond to that, as the Scrutiny Commission, you only have the power to scrutinise the Community Safety Partnership, not the police. The scrutinising the police is done by the Safe and Neighbourhood Board, not by the council. So you don't have the powers to call them in per se, but they are a member of the Community Safety Partnership group. So that's how they come in to living in Hackney, and they'll respond if there are community safety issues, which is what they've been responded to, but you can't scrutinise their activity. That's down to the Safe and Neighbourhood Board.
And just a general remark, I don't think that necessarily makes the lines of accountability as clear as they could be to the public. And I think that's certainly something we've experienced in terms of the scrutiny and child queue. So, but I mean, thank you very much for that explanation. So Councillor Adjara, did you want to come in?
I do kind of in principle agree what Councillor Patrick was saying, but also with regard to the name change for living in Hackney. I do think the name, as suggested by Councillor Joseph, is quite vague. However, I have already voiced my concerns. I don't know whether historically the same thing has been voiced before, but framing homes as such a succinct item within the context of whatever the name of the body is going to be, I think is quite problematic. Yeah, I know there's no funding for any of this. I've already voiced a suggestion that there needs to be a standalone body, whether it's short term or whatever, which can kind of do housing in a more linear way and an ongoing way in terms of scoping and reviewing and analysing data regularly, as opposed to the kind of stop and start that we have to undertake in living in Hackney. And framing it in this way, okay, the suggestion is potentially we could do a review over 6 months, which would take away from much of the other items that we have to cover within living in Hackney. So to me, it's problematic having homes at the centre of a commission when we can't give over the time that's necessary to do it in such a significant way. What we do is essential, but having it front and centre, I think, isn't potentially the best approach unless that's all we're going to be doing over the majority of our work programme. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Potter, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just further reflections, I think, following on from what Councillor Garbeck said. I mean, in terms of, you know, what we did here in Scrutiny Panel, we did a really good, thorough introductory piece of work across all of our commissions. And that would very much, and I think it'd be very confusing then if you have one commission that's got climate in the title, because I think very much our climate work needs to be across the whole council and to continue. So I think that is kind of problematic because it sits very strongly in SEG, it sits very strongly in children and young people in terms of education. And I'm sure Ben will tell me it sits, well, it does, it sits very strongly in health too. So I think it is a problem to use that title in.
Thank you. No, I mean, I'd agree with that. I think it's something maybe you would ask the officers to take away. And I think another thing that I have asked about at the Constitutional Committee really is about how cross-cutting policies are sort of embedded, and I think that needs to be reflected in scrutiny as well. I've now got Councillor Joseph. I hope we can hear you this time.
Oh, so do I. How's that? Oh, good. Yeah, sorry, I missed what some of the speakers were saying. I just caught the end of what Councillor Adjari was saying. So I would really like to support what she was saying on housing, really. It has increasingly become apparent that we just can't dedicate the time needed to look at the issues around housing on living in Hackney, when we're also covering policing, environment, climate issues. I do feel personally that there needs to be a housing committee, and I have looked at other boroughs just briefly this afternoon and found, you know, Islington's got a housing committee, as has Tower Hamlets, Waltham Forest, Camden. Waltham Forest has got 10 scrutiny committees, which is interesting. So how they support that, I'm guessing they just have smaller groups of people. I don't know if they have a lot more officers than us. Maybe that's something that we could look into, because I just feel to do a proper service for residents when our casework is about 90 to 95% housing, and there are so many issues, and they're only getting worse with the decrease in the amount of social housing we've got, and the repairs problems. I mean, we've had some really interesting meetings where I think we've managed to get residents really involved, but then in terms of following up, that's something that, you know, as the chair was saying, that's really difficult for us to do. So I would really really support having a standalone housing committee. That's all from me. Thank you.
Very much, Councillor Joseph. I think there's a very good points well made. I think we're going to probably be advised by Dawn Louisa slightly outside the scope of this constitutional review, but I mean, it is important to make those points. I've got Councillor Hayhurst. I don't know whether Councillor Conway's just joined us, whether she wants to contribute.
Thanks, Chair. I mean, just really, as you say, it's slightly outside the scope. Just to sort of, I mean, I think, Chair, you remember, I think Councillor Patrick as well, I think about 7 or 8 years ago, we had a review of the scrutiny function, didn't we? And at that point, we went down from 5 to 4 committees after an independent person came in. So I think, as Claire Joseph sort of indicated just there, there's all sorts of sort of complexities with this in terms of the resource implication if we rejig the structure. I fully appreciate the issue with housing and the issue that's there, and I think we just have to probably appreciate as councillors. I know the point about Waltham Forest having 10 committees. I'm fairly sure we are the best resourced in terms of officer corps of our scrutiny function across London, if not the country, because of the commitment that's gone in from executives, sort of the historic executives. So the consequence of us having another committee would be all of us are less resourced in our current committees, and how we feel about that. So it's quite a I don't think we can plausibly ask the executive to pay for another officer at the point of the massive cuts that we're having to see to other services. Bearing in mind we are the best resourced, I think. So I think it's just a really complex picture, that discussion. I haven't got answers to it, but just to add to it.
As a Hayhurst, I think that Tracy would like to come in on that point as well, and then I'll bring in Councillor Conway.
So yeah, I was just going to say a couple of the same things as Councillor Hayhurst, in the sense that to actually change the committees to establish new one, we'd actually have to do a whole review of the function. That's something completely outside the scope of this. But in terms of officer support, the model that we have we're the only council that has that model. Every other council has the maximum of 2 officers. So although you see 10 committees in Waltham Forest, they just have meetings. They don't do in-depth reviews because they don't have the officer support for it. So you have a one-to-one model, which was the main ethos of what all the members wanted to keep. And in order to do that, we have to keep to the number of officers that you have in terms of the commissions that are there. So if you do want a new one, that's a whole different piece of work that we'd have to do and a completely different review. And as Councillor Hayher said, that's an impact on officers, which there isn't, the budget for that.
Thanks, Tracy. I think Councillor Conway wants to come in, and then I can see Councillor Potter, and then we're probably going to conclude.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, in an ideal world, I agree with Councillor Joseph that, you know, it would be preferable for us to have greater capacity, but recognising that that may not be an option currently, I wonder if there is any work that we can do to look at the burden on each of the scrutiny commissions and to have a think about, I know that this might be a bigger piece of work than this particular, that what we're being asked for in this item will allow. But for example, I feel that there could be some work that we could do. For example, I think that a lot of the work on policing should probably happen between, you know, CYP and living in Hackney, because it's very difficult to look at only at policing of adults and to not have a conversation around the policing of children, because, you know, the two, they happen hand in hand. And equally looking at mental health within the sort of silo of children and young people, it fails to recognise sort of the, you know, that transition from children to adulthood. You know, it's a really important piece of the context that's missing if we're looking at these things in silos. And I wonder whether there might be a sort of happy medium where we're able to agree on areas that we look at jointly as a commission, and whether these might be, you know, that we have a commitment to sort of accommodate that within our individual commission somehow, or to have some meetings that sit outside of it. So for example, again, you know, the climate emergency, you know, I wonder whether that is something that we all commit to coming together, not in terms of how, you know, scrutiny panel would look at things, not in a more of a sort of general sense. So yeah, I just wonder whether there is any more that we can do together.
Councillor Potter?
I don't know, I can even say this in this meeting, whether it's relevant, but given the nature of what has been discussed tonight in terms of how significant housing is, you know, the work of housing, and obviously what you fed back, that we obviously need to do another, you know, it isn't part of this remit to look at adding another scrutiny committee as such. I mean, we have done deep dives into specific subject areas for a limited period of time on the task and finish type structure. Sorry, I can't remember, Tracy, whether that's kind of that's serviced by your team or not. But couldn't we at least look at doing that for housing to at least address some of the issues that Councillor Adajari is raising and Councillor Joseph's raising in, you know, the short to medium term?
So just in terms of task and finish group, that's done by Scrutiny Panel. Scrutiny Panel sets them up, and the resourcing of it is me. So it's my team again. So it's still us. So it would impact on all of the individual scrutiny commissions in terms of the support that you have and the work that you'd carry out, because obviously some of the officer time will be spent doing the task and finish group as well. So there isn't, it doesn't sit anywhere else. It sits with us. So it's still an impact for you on your individual scrutiny commissions as well. But I will add that in terms of housing, as chairs, you can decide if you want to focus 1 year just on housing, you can. That's completely within your gift to do that. In terms of the community safety, that's allocated to one scrutiny commission. So it was given to Living in Hackney, but it doesn't stop any of you working in collaboration and doing joint pieces of work. In terms of the climate, we took a different approach with that one, where each of the individual commissions did the bit that was relevant to their remit, and then we're we're in the process of pulling that together. So there is a report coming which will pull it all together through Scrutiny Panel. So with those cross-cutting piece of work, there is no reason why you can't agree jointly to cross over and do joint pieces. But in terms of scrutiny of the scrutiny for the Community Safety Partnership, that needs to sit with one commission, and that was with Living in Hackney. But you could choose, I suppose, to transfer it to another one, but it just needs to sit with one particular commission.
Briefly, in on that, Councillor Ajiari, do you might want to speak?
Yeah, do you know, I appreciate that, but yeah, doing housing for an entire year is not practical given the other kind of areas that we look into or scrutinise. So potentially, I mean, moving forward, better fiscal times, I'm looking over there. This may be something that potentially could happen in future, because my kind, in all honesty, I do feel housing deserves its own kind of framework in respect of scrutiny. But we do the best that we possibly can with the resources we got, and I believe we do a good job nevertheless in terms of the issues that we look into. So I'd like to thank you scrutiny team, but yeah, moving forwards potentially, thank you.
Thanks, everybody. We've more or less kept time, so that's fantastic. So I think that was hopefully a really helpful discussion. I mean, I do hear I think the main thing that I heard really was, I think the scrutiny leads were looking for, a sort of a flexible collaborative function which hears the voices of the public. And we want a constitution that assists us in that process and is accessible to the public, I think is, does that sound like a fair summary? I think it's important also just to sort of really remind ourselves that scrutiny is an actual essential part of the mayoral system, and the mayoral system, of governance in councils can't exist without scrutiny, as it's, sort of equal function really, to be a sort of check and balance and a challenge. So, I think I'm just reminding us really as a team, as scrutiny leads and also as scrutiny officers, that, this is one of our, the most vital functions in our constitution. So I don't know whether Dawn or Louise, you've got any sort of closing remarks, or we'll move on the agenda. And thank you very much for coming. I hope you found it helpful.
Yes, very helpful. Thank you so much for inviting us. And I think what myself and Louise will do is take away for consideration the points that have been raised by members tonight, and ensure that we provide, a detailed response to yourselves, but also continue to have that discussion within the Constitution Committee as well. I think it was really interesting that as we saw the conversations develop, I was thinking of some of the answers myself, but Tracy, being as wonderful as she is, got ahead of me and responded, especially the last point that where we were discussing, you were discussing around a dedicated scrutiny committee for housing, and essentially it's looking at how that collaboration can take place amongst the various scrutiny committees. So, for example, the excellent piece of work that was, or the excellent meeting that was held by yourselves last year around, in a response to child Q. So the collaboration between Living in Hackney and also the Children's Scrutiny Commission. I thought that was a really well-run meeting and demonstrated how varying or different scrutiny meetings can work together to address a single point. But we're happy to continue to work closely with Tracy and also with yourselves as scrutiny chairs to ensure that in this review of the Constitution, we take on board the points that have been made and see what points we can ensure are implemented in the review. But thank you very much.
And I think you'll also accept further comments in writing. It would be helpful if people copied me into it as well, as I'm a member of the committee. Thank you. Louise, okay, okay, thank you so much. I think we're going to move on. Under item. So Okay, so having started with our constitution, thank you very much, Councillor Troughton. I hope you found that useful. It's really helpful for you to attend. The next item, item 5, is the quarterly finance update. And I can see the screen's changing. We've got up to an hour for this item. So the Council's budget update scrutiny is a fixed item in the agenda of Scrutiny Panel. This is our quarterly finance update. Latest monthly reports are in the agenda on pages 37 to 102. So the finance reports included in the agenda are the OFP for November 2022 and the capital update and property disposals and acquisitions report for September 2022. So we're also, and thank you very much for circulating slides in advance. We're having an overview on the proposed council budget for 2023-24. And I think it's actually, although we've had to rejig the agenda a little bit this evening because the Mayor was unable to attend, I think it's really helpful that we've got enough space for this discussion, particularly at this sort of crucial time. So I'd like to welcome Councillor Robert Chapman, Cabinet Member for Finance, in Sourcing and Customer Service, who's joining us online. Ian Williams, Group Director of Finance and Corporate Resources, and Jackie Moylan, Director of Financial Management, who've been kind enough to join us in the chamber. So I'd now like to invite Ian to unmute his microphone and start his presentation. Just to warn you, Ian, that we've had I think members are probably going to want to ask questions as we go along. There's obviously quite a lot of information, so I'll be looking out for that probably after each slide. Thank you.
Great stuff, and good evening, everybody. Hope you're all well. Doesn't the year go by quickly? It doesn't seem that long since you were here last year, does it, going through the budget proposals? So you'll also be aware that the Council's budget report and all the appendices have also been published in line with what dispatches for Cabinet a week today, and then full Council obviously a week on Wednesday. So what we'll look to do this evening is do a very quick canter through effectively what's in those papers, but also some background, particularly to the work the Council's been doing on the cost of living challenges, and also cover the position. Obviously, listen to the conversation earlier about real interest there is in the housing revenue account, so we've got a section on that as well in the slides. Firstly, I'm going to give you a quick update on where we are also with the current year's budget forecast, of which we've got the detailed papers in the packs here, before going on to some of the other overview. Okay, so currently we're forecasting in the current financial year on the general fund an overspend of, as you can see there, just over £9 million, and what we're looking at, sorry, £7 million, and what we've looked to do is contain that as much as we can, given the considerable cost pressures the council's under at the moment, in particular in relation to inflation. We obviously had to find the resources to pay the pay award for the current financial year, which was a lot higher than the estimates that were included in the budget originally for 22-23, because at that time inflation was nowhere near the figures that it's been. General fund forecast is predominantly driven by other pressures also in adult social care and children's social care, and we've still got some one-off costs coming through dealing with the legacy now of the cyber attack, in particular things around backlog clearance and bringing forward investments in new systems. We recognise, like everybody, that it's not just the council that's facing significant financial pressures, also facing considerable pressures of our residents and also our businesses as well. And Jackie and I and the team did a presentation to local businesses only this afternoon to take them through the council's budget proposals as well. We've also been working hard to mitigate the impact on the council's budget of the significant energy and fuel and contract cost pressures that are coming through. And I think we've given updates previously to Scrutiny Panel around the work we've been doing in relation to that, as well as to Audit Committee. Turning to the housing revenue account, like the general fund, is under considerable pressure at the moment. What we've been able to do to balance the budget for the current year is, due to where we are with some of the delays in the procurement of the building maintenance contracts, we've been able to defer some expenditure on some of the housing stock, but obviously that ultimately will need to be caught up in time. But it has allowed us to, in effect, bring the housing revenue account budget into balance for 22-23, and also we're going to set out in the papers that follow proposals to balance for 23-24. Also, just draw people's attention to the significant capital programme the council continues to have. For the current financial year, we're estimating spend an outturn of around £165 million, so considerable investment in the borough's infrastructure. Still more to do in terms of making sure that some of those forecasts and profiling that we've been doing a lot of work with spending departments on can be improved, but what we have seen is considerable external factors at play, in particular real challenges in the market with getting contractors to hold the prices that they were quoting in the earlier stages of procurements. Currently, we've taken no new borrowing out in this current year, but obviously very mindful that the cost of borrowing has moved quickly in the last few months. The gilt yields and therefore PWLB rates continue to be forecast of being broadly steady over the medium term. But for example, that 4.5% figure at the end of December was a lot higher than where we were in August and September. But again, it reflects what we're seeing day to day in all financial markets. For example, what people are seeing in terms of costs to go and remortgage. Some economic context for you. 15th of February, so last week.
I mean, I'll start if no one else has. I think there may be some other ones. I mean, just obviously, you've managed to mitigate the overspend because they're not developing a full capital programme. I mean, that's obviously not necessarily a completely sustainable position. I mean, it's obviously going to impact on the ongoing maintenance and value of our of our housing, of our estates. Is there also going to be any delay in terms of building? Because if in terms of building, how's that all going to impact? I mean, I think it's obviously not it's a less than ideal situation, let's put it that way. I think there may be other members who've got questions on that. Thank you. So Joseph, did you want to come in as well before Ian responds? I think if it's a similar point.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ian. My question was just on the HRA and the contract management. Has that been a little bit of a concern historically, and certainly something that's come up at Living in Hackney? So I'm just wondering to what extent we're holding contractors to account financially when they produce less than good quality work. For example, I mean, I was reassured by colleagues that the very famous girder doors, which were peeling off, are in fact being paid for by girder. But in similar cases, for example, with housing repairs, where we have contractors that either don't turn up or turn up and do a bit of work and go away again, which is a big complaint. I mean, are there penalties? Are there fines? Are we managing those contracts to make sure that we're being compensated when the work is less than good? And also just touching on the legal disrepair, the cost of legal disrepair housing is, I think, currently at 2.7 million. So at what extent are we passing those costs back to the subcontractors? Thank you, Ian.
Unless there's any more questions, if I take those two now, is that okay, Councillor Gordon? So we will also go into a bit more detail later on in the...
So it was just, one will be very, very short. It's just the implications of using the RCCO in the way in which we're about to, longer term, moving things, looking further along the line, what will that look like for us in terms of having used the expenditure in that way now to cover the overspend?
And absolutely, and I'll cover that particularly in a bit more detail later on in the presentation when we talk about the budget proposals for the HRA for 2023-24. So just to take your question first, Councillor Gordon, obviously, it has been a real challenge getting the building maintenance contracts to a better place. We've struggled over a number of years to have the calibre and the quality of works being done by external contractors that we want. That's one of the reasons which the council has undertaken to start to grow and develop the DLO more. Obviously, there are limits to some of the work the DLO can do, some of the real higher story work in terms of where you need specialist equipment to do. But what we have been investing in is growing the DLO to make sure that we can do more of the everyday type of repairs, be it the kitchens, be it the bathrooms, be it the regular day-to-day maintenance stuff ourselves, because I think that ultimately is good, because ultimately people, particularly if we can get more people to work for us locally on local jobs, that's a good thing. But also it means that we cut out any profit element from us paying contractors ourselves. But it does take time to get those people into roles that we need. In terms of the maintenance contracts, we have had some significant challenges as part of the procurement processes we've been running, particularly because as an industry, there's real issues in just the contractors being able to get the relevant tradespeople to do bulk works on housing stock. Brexit has had an impact in terms of the availability of labour. We'll probably all see it in different aspects of our personal lives, where we need to get works done to our houses, and actually it is not as easy getting the works done. You often have to have a lot longer lead times, and I'm sure some of you on this call and in the room have heard me recount the challenges I had when the snow and the ice all melted and flooded my house. So but the time it took to get people to be able to do those works is not insignificant. But we are working hard to get those maintenance contracts up to speed. I'm working closely with my colleague, Group Director for Climate, Homes and Economy, Ricardo Hyatt, and the Director of Housing, Steve Waddington, to make sure that the corporate team that Rotimi oversees is giving housing all the support it can do to bring forward the maintenance procurement contracts. I'm very happy to bring an update, whether it's to Living in Hackney Scrutiny, if that's the right place, or back to Scrutiny Panel at the next one of these meetings, just to sort of update members on where we've got to with all that, if that's helpful. Turning to the specific point that's been raised also around revenue contribution to capital, it isn't a sustainable long-term measure that we could adopt. We need to be spending that money on our housing stock, but in the immediate time where there aren't works taking place to the level they have done historically, because of the reasons I've outlined, it makes sense to switch that contribution to enable us to pay the revenue costs that the housing revenue accounts incurring, in particular the higher pay award, the higher costs around energy, and other pressures that are coming through that we talk about in later parts of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now let you get on with it a bit, but it's I think we wanted to really sort of acknowledge our concerns really about the HRA. I do realise there's a lot of slides to get through, and you're coming into future proposals.
So the economic context, again, no real surprise to people that inflation continues to still run at a high figure. There is an expectation set by the Bank of England that inflation in the UK is due to fall by 4% later on this year. We'll have to wait and see, I think, what happens in other parts of the world to see whether that ultimately pans through. We saw as well that the Bank of England continues to increase the base rate. We'll wait and see what again happens when they meet as well. The current energy price guarantee for households will be revised in April 23 and will continue to operate until April 24. The £400 payments, which has been currently being paid to people, will cease at the end of March, and the cap will be £3,000 rather than the £2,500 cap that was initially set. Also worth knowing that the scheme for business support in relation to energy will not apply to local authorities, schools and charities. I'm sorry, will apply to schools and charities, but not to local authorities. The aggregate increase in local government spending power following the settlement came in at around 9%, but as I'll come on to explain later, a significant element of that related to the expectation that local authorities would increase council tax. And what was quite noticeable in the settlement was the increase in the headroom given to councils in terms of referendum limits that they can now utilise. So, for example, instead of the overall social care preset council plus council tax being an increase of 3%, it was possible for local authorities to increase it to a combined figure of 5%. And we saw last week, didn't we, that those councils that have experienced significant financial challenge and significant organisational issues through decisions that have been taken over many years, were given even further flexibilities, with councils like Croydon being allowed to increase council tax by 15% and others by up to 10%. But I think we mustn't underestimate that this is still a one-year settlement. As a council, and Councillor Chapman has written many letters with the Mayor to explain the need to give councils certainty, not just 1 year, but for over the medium term. And it's disappointing that we haven't had a settlement that it goes beyond next financial year. Turning to the provisions within it, what we did see, and I think again on the back of some of the lobbying, that there was a recognition of the real pressures councils experience, particularly in terms of social care, and so there were grants that enabled us to close some of that budget gap cost pressures we were experiencing from the utilisation of social care monies. In addition to that, we continue to see the new homes grant total payments to all councils continue to be reduced as that source of funding is slowly phased out from what it was when it was brought in many years ago now. Something which I know this Scrutiny Panel has been interested in over many years has been just some background work we did as part of the development of the budget process into disparities that continue to exist in council funding. And I thought it was just useful to summarise in the next few slides some of the research we have undertaken and been through that was released only last week, that shows local government funding has tended to favour relatively prosperous areas over the last 13, 14 years or so. And what it shows is that the annual changes in spending power, which, as I've alluded to before, is the government's preferred measure of council funding, including things like council tax, business rates, core grants, for all top tier councils since 2011-12, has seen that the current 5 poorest upper tier council areas in terms of things like deprivation and other indicators have experienced an average 7% increase in power by 23-24, whilst at the same time, the 5 least deprived areas, places like West Berkshire, Richmond, have seen an increase in spending power of 24%. And one of the simple reasons for that is that the reliance placed on council tax and raising council tax to fund council services inevitably favours councils with a higher tax base, i.e. more. And what I mean by higher tax base is more properties at the higher end of the bands. So as opposed to in Hackney, where we've got basically 60-odd% of our properties are band A, B and C, in places like Richmond, in Westminster and others, they will have the reverse of that. And so every 1 percentage point of council tax income raised will be a lot higher in terms of aggregate sum compared to what it is in Hackney. A very short, quick table there, summarising some of that.
Do you mind if I just
Yes, certainly.
ask a quick question on that? So, so this is council tax, business rates, and core grants aggravated. I mean, there's obviously a lot of that money is already allocated. Is that including the dedicated schools grant and social care, or are there any other sources of funding that we?
No, so just so I'll be clear on that, when I talk about core spending power for local authorities, it is does not include dedicated schools grant. That is outside of this calculation. It is a very simplistic, comparison of the core sources of funding. So it'll be the social care grants and council tax, and your share of business rates, and any other grants. For example, new homes bonus would be another one in that mix.
So, so for a council like Hackney, where there's a lot of poverty and households very impacted by the cost of living crisis, there's an increasing dependency on council tax revenue to fund our core services.
Because of the time at which council tax was established, so back in the early 90s, Hackney had a relatively low tax-based position, because when the valuations of properties were done, the value of properties in Hackney was nothing like it is today. It had a significantly higher number of bands A, B and C properties than say councils in the west of London and other parts of the country.
Just for interrupting you again, so I just wanted to ask those questions. Thank you.
Okay, so as I say, this table just sort of tries to bring to life a little bit more what I was just describing. Turning on to the next slide here again, what we've tried to do is just show a bit more analysis of this to try and bring to life the distributions between the different types of local authority, be it metropolitan areas, shire counties, and Met districts. And what you can see for strictly core spending power increases is that for London boroughs, they saw core spending power increase in the current, for the forthcoming financial year, just than £40 million. This slide, I think, shows the trajectory which has, which particularly councils in London have been on since 2010, and shows in real terms that over the period through to, since 2010-11, and notwithstanding the flexibilities to continue to increase council tax by a greater rate than previously, you can see that in real terms, councils in London have seen an 18% reduction in real terms spending power over that period.
Yeah, Councillor Potter.
Comment really. I mean, the evidence you show for the disparity of councils is exactly the opposite of what the government stated intention was in terms of its levelling up agenda. It's really disheartening to see, you know, the authorities that really need the money that are only getting 7% rise throughout the country, and the wealthiest are getting 24%. So yeah, appreciate the analysis and the bigger picture context.
It's really, really helpful to get that context. Thank you.
Already covered quite a few of the points on this slide already, really, in the commentary of the graphs and things. So what the settlement means for Hackney and for the council's budget, which is now available online, is that we can raise council tax by 5%, 2% more than had originally been assumed, and that raises about an extra £2 million in overall revenue. So broadly, a rule of thumb that we now operate to for monies raised by a 1 percentage point increase in council tax is around £1 million, as our overall rate has changed over the years and our overall tax base continues to grow as well. Some of the social care monies announced enabled us to not have to put in as much growth and therefore make as many savings as we were anticipating to have to make because of the social care monies that came forwards, but you mustn't underestimate the challenges that still brings. For the HRA, probably worth just reminding that the rent cap was above what was included in the consultation that originally came out just towards the end of the summer break, when it was based around the sort of equality impact assessment the government had to do, assume maybe a 5% increase, but there was considerable lobbying by all councils to recognise that, you know, simply imposing artificial below inflation ability to raise income on housing revenue accounts placed them under an even greater strain than they were already facing, particularly as housing revenue accounts never received any support during the pandemic in the same way that general fund services ultimately did. But also mustn't underestimate the HRA is under considerable pressure, and we'll see in a moment, and probably also pick it up at the deep dive audit committee doing next Monday into reserves and comparable reserve levels across London and across the country, to show that, you know, HRA is now particularly under significant pressure, as are the schools budgets as well.
Sorry, Ian. I think you're going on to the second part of your budget report now. Yeah, just maybe another chance for questions if people have got any questions on the sort of general background context before we go into the budget setting. Councillor Patrick.
Yeah.
Councillor Joseph in a minute.
Looking at the proposals for 2024-25, obviously I know we haven't set this year's budget, but we're about to set it in 2 weeks' time, so it's pretty much in stone. But I'm just thinking, obviously, we've only had 1 year settlement, so we don't know what next year's settlement is. But taking on board most of the settlements we've had from the government, you normally predict it quite well, you and your colleagues. Can you predict the premium bond numbers or the lottery as well? But perhaps if you could, you wouldn't be here. But seriously, is there anything, obviously some of the savings we're already making will mitigate some of the savings we need to make, but is there things that we could do now, like building housing for care and increasing our in-house SEM places that will save in the long run against the revenue budgets? Because I know the presentations we've had at House Scrutiny a few times about the cost of residential placements, and that if we built housing with care, that would enable more people, not only not have to go into residential homes, but be able to stay in the borough where their friends are, and also SEN places. I know we're looking at increasing them in primary levels at the moment. I know there's discussions going on, but I just wonder about secondary level. Speaking to people at school governors, they talk about children that are expelled constantly from secondary schools because secondary schools can't cope with them because they need special provision, but there isn't the specialist provision within the borough, and specialist provision out of the borough costs so much. So I do wonder whether there's things we could do to spend to save in the long run and provide better services.
Yeah, no, so I absolutely endorse and agree with all those comments, Councillor Patrick. We always certainly look to identify opportunities where we can to invest to ultimately deliver a saving in the long term. You highlighted a number of areas in your sort of question. SEND is certainly one that we are looking extensively at. There have been a number of capital investment proposals that have already come forwards to change and to invest in some of our schools' estate to increase our own in-house capacity, as opposed to require us to go and effectively buy that capacity from the private sector or from places outside of the borough. And there may be a point where we can actually ultimately sell some of those services where we've generated that capacity in-house. So that is something that is being looked at really closely in terms of SEND. The points to make about social care are ones I'm also very live to. And only last week I was discussing with Helen, Group Director for Adults Health and Integration, what areas she thinks it would be really helpful for us to increase and invest in developing our own capacity. I think the point that you'll be well aware of with your experience on the council is that building those facilities quickly and at pace is absolutely what we've got to do, but we also must make sure that what we do is done properly, and also there's work to do about deciding where is best for some of those facilities to be in terms of where in the borough that location would be, and that again is something we're looking to bring forwards. So that would be a real joint council effort between the Health and Adults Directorate, Climate Homes Economy, obviously supported by the finance corporate teams as well. I think the other area I'd also say that we are giving even more attention to at the moment is around energy resilience and security. So we're continuing to look at opportunities to speed up our ability to put in more solar panels on roofs so that we've got more certainty and control over the prices that ultimately we experience, because we generate it ourselves where we can. But as you'll all be aware, you have to have the right roof places to put it on, and not all structures are suitable to put that type of facility on. Thanks.
So, and I've got Councillor Joseph online.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah. Just a quick one on the HRA. I recently asked for the figures on what our HRA debt was, and I was told that it's currently around £110 million. And I was just wondering if we could get a breakdown of what that money has been used for, because obviously there are councils that are in a position where they can borrow to boost the HRA, but with our level of debt there, I can understand it. That might not be something that we would want to do. So I was just wondering why we were in that significant level of debt and what projects that's been used to fund. I don't know if you have all the answers now, but it would be good to find out. Thank you.
No, so certainly happy to answer that, Councillor Joseph. And I think it's a really very good question and a very topical question as well, because ultimately, as a council, we've tended to look to borrow internally as opposed to externally. So I'd much rather use cash that we hold and borrow that internally than effectively go and pay higher rates of interest on external borrowing. But obviously, as that internal borrowing is accessed, what you end up is having to borrow more externally, and that's what we have started to do over the last few years. In terms of our overall debt figures, you're right, that's broadly the figure that we've been looking at. But I think what I would also say is that balance between external and internal debt. Currently, we've got external borrowings of around £68 million. that's our external borrowing. But it's not simply a matter of just going and saying, can we borrow more or differently? You've got to be able to afford, just like in our own personal lives, you've got to be able to afford to service the cost of that debt. And so any debt that we borrow for in relation to the housing revenue account needs to be financed through that account. And that ultimately means some choices being made between investing in our existing stock and servicing and running our existing stock, to taking on additional borrowings, either to be funded via either private sales in some instances, and the rental streams that flow from the new properties. So a piece of work I'm doing with Ricardo at the moment is really making sure we've got a real tight grip, as you'd expect, on any impacts of external borrowing, because we know what the ambitions are of the administration to move forwards with. The development of the 1,000 units that both Ricardo and I co-sponsored from the officer side in the report that went to Cabinet just before Christmas.
Thanks so much, Ian. I think this is a really important question. It's really interesting to hear your answer. I think it would be really helpful for the panel to have a bit more information, certainly on borrowing and the cost of borrowing and what projects it's funding. So if that's possible, thank you. I'll now bring in Councillor Hayhurst.
Thanks, Chair. Just very briefly, the point that Councillor Patrick raised in terms of spend to save on extra social care provision, we've certainly got an item planned. I think it now may be March or possibly April before we have it, just to inform colleagues, really, just to try and keep a watching brief and greater understanding on that. And I think, as Ian knows, I was sort of championing that, and Rob knows, at the pension committee last time as well, as to whether any whether the amount that we're allowed to spend from the pension committee in borough could also be used for that similar sort of purpose, or other Hackney capital programs. One specific question on King's Hall. Just where are we up to, Ian? Because obviously we got the levelling up money for Hackney Central, but we didn't. I think, as I understood it, we put in 2 applications, and the second one was more related to King's Hall, which I don't think we did get. So where are we in terms of timescales on the revamp of that from a financial point of view? And also just on the energy issue and what you just alluded to about perhaps your number one capital spend priority at the moment is getting solar panels out there. I very much welcome that, because I think that's an obvious area. What is, I appreciate there'll be outsourced costs of energy to different providers, but what is the council's energy bill a year? Are we talking 1 million, 500,000, 2 million? Just just give us some rough idea, and then that, if you can, and then that just gives us some scope about what we're talking about and about the risk, bearing in mind you mentioned that the local authorities are excluded from any support.
So quite a few questions there. So I'll try and take them in the order that in reverse order, if that's okay. So energy costs. I suppose it's just important to recognise that there's a lot more energy costs we incur than just say for buildings like this and the council's core campus. When we buy energy through the various framework contracts, we also secure the energy for our housing estates, for our leisure centres, and for a whole range of the public assets that we're effectively the custodians for. We also enable our schools to access those contracts so that they can also have the opportunity to access cheaper energy costs through a sort of bulk buying arrangement that we're party to across London. So in very ballpark terms, I think you'd be looking at energy costs in the order of, I was going to say, around 14 to 15 million pounds, and thankfully Jackie's just found the spreadsheet with that number on for me, which actually does say that, so I'm quite reassured by my memory isn't failing me today, which is a good thing. But that gives you a sense of the scale of what our exposure to energy is. You mentioned also...
Can you say what it was 3 years ago or 2 years ago compared to the hike? I mean, how much differential have we seen?
Yeah, so probably the best way of us answering that is the sorts of sums we've had to add into the budget in recent times. I would say we've been pretty seeing an increase of maybe not 100%, but I would say between 80 and 90% from recollection. So that gives you a sense of the real pressures that we've seen come through in terms of additional energy costs. The best example that I've seen to sort of bring that to life for people a bit would be, so in 2019 the energy costs for our leisure estate was just under £900,000. Now bearing in mind leisure is a very high user, high demander of energy, particularly where swimming pools are. The estimate we've had for the leisure estate, when we looked at it a few months ago, would be just under £3 million. Now, recognising that one of the big changes since 2019 is the old Britannia Leisure Centre has been replaced by the new one. So we're not comparing pure apples with apples. But that said, that gives you a sense of the increase which has been experienced on that sort of obvious part of the estate where it sort of brings it to life a bit. So that was the hopefully answer to your question on energy. On levelling up, you're right. We were successful with one of the bids, and we've secured around £19 million for Hackney Central. I think we did very well to be successful with one of the bids. From recollection, only 5 or 6 London boroughs were successful. A number weren't, and obviously there were a number of other authorities outside of London who've made, not insignificant representation to the extent of their disappointment that their bids weren't in any way successful, notwithstanding the costs that some had incurred also putting in those bids. In terms of King's Hall, though, I would say that we always recognised what a valued and much cherished asset that is for the borough. The reason we did put in bid for King's Hall was partly why not, but very much in our medium-term financial planning, and what you'll see set out in the capital investment strategy section of the main report is we've been factoring in increased costs and recognising the additional borrowing on the general fund that we'd need to take on for that facility should a programme to take it forwards go forward. We will be coming back in due course with detailed plans to set out what will be happening with King's Hall. It is very clear that doing nothing is not an option, because none of us want to see something like a Haggerston Bath situation repeat itself. We've already committed significant sums of money to protect that building in the short term, whilst also making sure that any of the investment we do in the short term isn't going to be lost should the bigger, wider project come forwards.
But are we talking spade in the ground in this administration?
I would be surprised if that doesn't happen. Obviously, there's a lot of work to be done on making sure that all the heritage and the consultations that need to happen. But certainly that would be our expectation, that we would be starting a scheme. But an awful lot of public consultation still needs to take place, obviously, because that facility is, as we sit here now, currently extensively used, isn't it?
Thank you very much. I think we now need to get on with the budget report, Ian, so I'll hand back over to you. Thank you so much.
Certainly. So, annual budget report, again, no real surprises to people on this committee that what ultimately it does is it sets out recommendations for council tax levels, revenue budgets, the Treasury Management Strategy, Prudential Code indicators, as well as my statement as Section 151 officer, that the budget is robust and we have adequate reserves and balances. Furthermore, it also considers the financial planning horizon, including economic and local finance context. It also goes on to set out the budget challenge which we've been through, and I'd really like to place on record my thanks to my team, Jackie and colleagues in all directorates, but also to Councillor Chapman and the corporate leadership team with Mayor and Cabinet, who've got us through probably what has been, as always, a very challenging budget cycle, probably one of the most challenging in very uncertain times of what we've seen happen in the world in the past year on the back of the pandemic, on the back of cyber attack. In the appendices and key documents that are there, we'll see things like the capital strategy, the medium-term financial plan, as well as our own assessment of our financial management arrangements. The following slides go through some of the main elements of the budget report. So the first thing to point out is it's recommending that the Hackney element of council tax will increase by just under 5%, so 4.99, and a Band D that equates to an increase of £63.65. When the GLA and the Mayor of London's precept is added to that, of which he's proposing to increase his element of the precept by £38.55, so an increase of just under 10%. When the two are added together, as you can see on that table, it means an aggregate increase at Band D of just over 6%. Increasing council tax, as you know, is essential to protecting our financial position. It means that the resources we raise locally are within our control, and that the recommended increases in the context of significant cumulative external funding losses over many years, ongoing inflationary pressures, and significant pressures coming through, not just in relation to adult social care and children's services, but also homelessness, TA, and special education needs budget. We have also recognised the affordability of this increase for residents, and have therefore budgeted to double the government's council tax support scheme of a £25 payment to council tax reduction recipients, and what we've actually done is increased it to £50 of their capped at their liability. As set out later in the presentation, we also go on to continue to support those in financial hardship through a whole range of packages of support through our cost of living response. Slide here just sort of tries to bring to life where the money and which money is spent, and you can see the pie chart there shows that the net revenue budget's totaling just over £355 million, and how that is broken down by respective directorates. Obviously, we also have a considerable number of external payments we need to make for things like concessionary fares, North London Waste Authority levy, as well as minimum revenue provision and provision for the pay award for 23-24. In terms of my statement as Section 151 officer, obviously need to make sure that the robustness of the estimates and the adequacy of the proposed reserves is set out, and also draws attention to the requirement ultimately to need to find another potentially up to £57 million over the period 24-25 through to 26-27, the medium scenario in our sort of range of the continuing challenges that local authorities like Hackney faced. Attention also draws to section 22 of the report, which is the ambitious capital programme, and also noting the significant increase in borrowing requirement that we would need to make sure we can accommodate within the revenue budget, and that's factored into our medium-term financial forecast. Council holds, as you know, a significant number of reserves to mitigate risks, to balance the budget, but also is clear advice that I'm setting out in this report is that over the medium-term position, given we've held the earmarked 15 million balance for many years now, that given inflation, given the erosion of the value of money over certainly the last few years, but actually over the last 10, 12 years, it's necessary to consider increasing that over the medium-term period to around £20 million. To summarise, and based upon the measures in place to manage the delivery of savings, the provisions made in relation to contingency sums, so I'm comfortable that the report sets out sufficiently robust and adequate levels of reserves. Turning to the capital programme, again, just broken down a bit more what sorts of things are included in here, but the schedule's in your committee papers that you'll no doubt be looking forward to reading over the next week or so. Go into considerable detail about all the proposals that the council has to invest in all aspects of its infrastructure, be it physical buildings, be it the vehicles that we need to enable officers to do their jobs out and about. Go on to set out also how the capital programme is proposed to be financing, and you can see over the period, the greater reliance on borrowing that we are now having to rely upon. This table summarises what I described around the medium-term financial plan and the forecasts. So you can see here that through to 25-26, we've been forecasting around £40 million, rising to that £57 million over 26-27. But what we really need is government to come forwards with not just additional resources for local authorities to recognise the considerable cost and inflationary pressures we're facing, but also certainty as to what the funding levels will be. I'll happily move on to the housing revenue account budget for next year, if that's okay, Chair. HRA budget, as mentioned earlier, increasing rents by 7% to just over £115 a week, which is in line with the government rent cap announced in November 22. Probably just worth reminding ourselves that, you know, our rents, Hackney Council House rents are the 7th lowest in London, and certainly when you compare those rents to housing associations in the borough of £148 a week, the private sector £640 a week, it still is a very good deal. But ultimately, that increase is needed to enable us to in some way respond to inflationary pressures. Alongside that, there'll be increases in service charges for things like concierge, landlord lighting, heating, to reflect the actual costs we're incurring. The proposals include some just over £14 million of savings, in part managed through reducing the RCCO for next year, but as part of the business plan going forwards, the recognition that needs to be built back into the budget, and there's a plan to build that figure up over the forthcoming years, in line with when all the maintenance contracts start to be implemented and spend be incurred. The budget is set to balance the competing priorities of maintaining the investment in our housing stock, ensuring safety for our residents in their homes, maintaining and improving the service we deliver to tenants, leaseholders. Budget proposals enables us to continue to invest also in additional £4.8 million for responsive repairs, and including a further £1 million investment in damp and mould repairs, as well as maintaining our core housing service, including the tenancy sustainment team, further support into capacity for transformation, as well as a £51 million maintenance programme for our housing stock in terms of, you know, day-to-day and more medium-term repairs. Engagement process has been undertaken an engagement process has been undertaken with residents around the rent increase, and you'll no doubt be aware of that. In addition to that, there's also going to be in the spring, following the lines set out in the residents' engagement strategy, you know, proposals to have that open and honest conversation that recognises that in the real terms we have less money to spend than we had, and that we want to ensure that we proactively target spend of available budget in a way that reflects priorities. And this will inform the housing revenue account, business plan refresh and budget setting for 24-25. Quick slide here that shows the forecast of the HRA business plan through to 27-28. Again, you can see the rebuilding of the RCCO, the requirement to make savings, and then the view taken that, you know, obviously rents will continue to rise in line with, you know, the expectations of the housing revenue account business plan. I'll keep going, Chair, if that's okay. Very quickly, members will have seen earlier presentations to previous meetings of our response to cost of living, but just to recap, and as has been previously reported, the council already has that poverty framework, and it prioritises prevention, early years, early help, tackling low wages and cost of living, and responding to the material needs of poverty. Informed by the work we did during the pandemic, when we tried from the outset to focus our response on those on lower incomes who were going to be impacted, whilst campaigning for more funding. And we've also continued to bake in, you know, those better ways of working, you know, cross-council work, so that we look at things as a system, not just in silos. The Money Hub has been a real success since it launched in November, where we've brought in and developed internally specialist team who will support those in severe hardship where they have no other source of monetary support available. And through the Money Hub, we're able to offer support in terms of the discretionary award scheme, the council tax reduction scheme, discretionary housing payments, and also through allocation of the household support fund. And, you know, when I already meet regularly with the team, it's really impressive the sort of stories you're hearing in terms of by working closely with residents in real acute need, getting to know their particular circumstances, particularly where they haven't accessed funds that they're entitled to. We've seen some really material interventions and changes to people's situations, and already that team is more than earning its keep in terms of the extra resources that residents are now accessing. And I think, you know, sorts of the early reviews that both Councillor Chapman and I have done, and when talking to the team, show that, you know, the money it's putting into people's pockets that otherwise wouldn't have been done is making a real material difference. Well on track to spend all the financial support. I know this committee, like others, is always keen to understand where we've got to with making sure those discretionary schemes are working as hard as they can for us, and we're well on track to have dispensed all of the resources that were allocated for the budget. And just by way of reminder, all the fuel rebates, that £150 council tax rebate scheme, was fully paid out to all recipients. Finally, turning to the Household Support Fund, again, continue to put in place the extensive support of around £2.8 million from October through to March, with the remaining 2.6 million being used in the following ways: children and families, help with housing costs, Hackney Giving, the trusted referral partners. I'll say OFP goes into great detail about all the various interventions and support that we're making. And I think that's the end of the slideshow by the looks of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. I was a bit worried you're going to lose your voice having to go through all of that. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'll open it to questions in a minute, but just a couple of quick questions from me. Obviously, reference to possibility of increasing our reserves. I know that our audit colleagues are doing a deep dive on reserves. I just really wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about that. I think it looks like Councillor Chapman might want to come in here about really how that decision would be made, what sort of factors would be taken into account, where where we would find the money. I mean, so just what sort of timescales? I'd just know a little bit more about that. I think I've got other colleagues wanted to come in, but if you could just start with that one. I don't know whether you want to come in on that, Councillor Chapman, or on something else, or generally sum up, or.
I was just going to generally basically thank Ian for a really comprehensive presentation there, which I really haven't got a lot to add to. Just to say, obviously, that we've got a budget coming up, which we're putting together under the difficult circumstances that Ian described, with the government funding still below those at the level it was at 210, and while we had a temporary uplift this year to get just because of the government's own troubles, that you could see from the medium-term financial forecast that doesn't help us in the long term, and we still got some serious decisions to make in future. But I would say that we've got a budget we're putting forward which is going to council on the 1st of March, which will. No significant cuts in frontline services. We've identified some money to help us to implement our manifesto and keep our promises to residents. And although we've regrettably had to put up council tax, recommended put up council tax up to the full 4.99% limit, we are enhancing the cost of living support schemes there with an offer to working age council tax reduction schemes claimants, which will compensate for the increase in tax and make sure we protect the vulnerable members in our community. If I go on much longer, I'll be repeating Ian, so I will leave it there. And if there's any questions that you want to ask directly to me, I'm happy to do that. I'll leave him with initially to respond on reserves, but I will just say, because I know it's been a controversial issue, that and we're going to go through reserves, aren't we, with an audit deep dive to look at that in some detail. We're completely transparent about it, and it's all in the accounts, but they're never going to be an easy option. All those reserves are there for a purpose. They're there to protect the position, and they're part of the reason that we've been, I think, so successful as a council in our the way we've been able to robustly manage our finances over the years. In the way some not too far from us have not. Without anyway, you read the news. And even a lot of these reserves are capital, so they could never be used to prop up the revenue budget. And even where they're not, they're only available once. You can only use reserves once, and once they're used, the following years they cannot be used to fund ongoing revenue. And the thing about reserves, obviously, they're all there for a reason. So if they are used at any particular point, just as in housing, as Ian's just talked about, we have to make a plan in place. Better got a plan in place to put them back. So, under no circumstances really are reserves an easy option for resourcing council expenditure in the way I think that some people have put it. But on that point, I'll pass back to Ian.
Councillor Chapman. Ian, did you want to?
Yeah, certainly very, very quickly. And I think just to clarify exactly what I said earlier, it was in relation to the unearmarked balance of £15 million that I was proposing to increase in my report. That's basically the money that we hold for any unknown, uncertain eventualities, and one of those has happened very recently. So as we currently sit here now, we're spending significant sums of money funding the event that's happened up in Stoke Newington in terms of the costs for the scaffolding, the costs for a whole range of other associated things, of which I know a number of people have been briefed on fully. And it is not certain in any way that we will ever see any of that money back through the insurers of the relevant buildings. So that is just one example of things. And I think the point I make, £15 million, which was the figure back in 2007 when I started as the unearmarked balance, gets you an awful lot less than it does in 2023. And that's why, having done benchmarking, having done a lot of detailed analysis, my recommendation to members is that to maintain our financial position, we should look to increase that modestly over the medium-term position. One way of doing that will be, should any windfall income come in, we would look to earmark that and just use it to build that balance up. But we'll go through that in more detail, I'm sure, next Monday.
Thank you very much. And I'll bring in Councillor Hayhurst.
Thank you. Fully endorse what Councillor Chapman said, thanking Ian, but also in terms of the reserves, and supportive of what Ian is saying in terms of increasing the reserves. On Rob's point, it's the bedrock of our financial stability over the years, and having the confidence to know that we've got that, and then we can maybe, if we need to make a slightly more risky decision on council tax support or other things, you can do so because you've got the confidence. You've got the confidence that's sitting behind you. It's an absolute bedrock of where we are, and Ian's point about the fact that it hasn't increased for a number of years, but everything else has gone up, I think it's entirely appropriate that we look to increase that pot up. Ian, can I ask one specific question to understand it on the capital programme and the financing of that through debt? So I just want to understand how that slide's now gone, and I can't recall the amount. But how do we then pay that debt back, bearing in mind an increased proportion of the capital spend is via debt? Is it because you have worked out in future years we're due to get receipts that cover that off? Or are we constantly sitting with an underlying debt amount that is growing? Can you just explain sort of how that works on the capital side?
No, certainly, and very happy to answer that. So in very simple terms, a bit like when someone takes out a mortgage payment that's principal and interest, what we're required to do by government is, and accounting regulations, is to make what's called a minimum revenue provision, which is to write down the value of the debt outstanding over an appropriate number of years relating to the type of asset that debt has been taken out to deliver. So very clearly what we see through the increased cost of capital in the budget report is effectively recognising as we're borrowing more, we're having to increase the amount of minimum revenue provision we make to continue to write down that debt over an appropriate period of time. So
the revenue, sorry, just to understand, so the revenue that we pay to write that down over, say, a 25-year period, is that money that generally then comes in as income into the capital pot because, for example, we've got a new asset that we're charging out, and over a 25-year period we plan to pay it back? Is that how it works?
Yeah, so in some cases, if there was a particular asset that generated an income stream, then that might be one where we wouldn't have to make such an increase in the financing cost of capital. So as an example, if you think of a good one, if we were to invest in, absolutely, yeah. So the GP surgery, so let's think of one that's a good example for your scrutiny chairing. What we've managed to do there is we take the income that we generate from rent and we use that to effectively finance the debt that we've incurred, and at the same time, not just finance the interest cost, but if you think of a mortgage perspective, the principal and the interest. So over a period of years, what we do ultimately is write down the value of the debt we've incurred in relation to those assets. Does that make sense?
It does, and so the proportion of debt that the capital fund is paying has sort of gone up from 5 years ago to what now? What sort of trajectory are we looking at?
I think Jackie's got the papers to hand.
Yeah, in terms of that, I suppose a good way of looking at it, if you look at the presentation that was circulated on the capital slides, where it shows the proportion of expenditure over that 4-year period, which is covered by debt, next to it, it sets out that the impact on the revenue budget. So effectively, as Ian says, we have to set aside amounts to repay that debt and also to pay the interest. So, for example, in 23-24, if my memory serves me correct, we've set aside about 6 million of the revenue budget to meet those those repayments. In 26-27, it's looking more like 20 million. So, effectively, what we're saying is that the provision to repay our debt and to pay those interest costs is increasing significantly, because we're seeing a big increase in what we're having to borrow.
Yeah.
That helps.
Yeah.
Thanks, that's extremely helpful. I don't think I can see any more questions in the room or online, and we're running slightly out of time. We've got one more item. Yeah, I mean, I'd just really like to thank both Ian and Jackie for really helpful presentation. And I think the comparisons, the bar charts, are particularly helpful. It's also obviously really helpful to have an update on the measures in terms of the cost of living crisis and the money hub. And it's in our next scrutiny panel meeting, we're obviously going to be looking at an update on the poverty strategy. So we'll be looking for more detail about how those work in the context of the whole strategy. So thank you very much. So I'll now try and find my so we're now going to move on to the final item, which is an update on the council tax reduction scheme, scrutiny task and finish group. So just to briefly introduce this, the directly elected mayor and cabinet made a commitment to review the rate of contribution for working age adults eligible for council tax support. Scrutiny panel set up the council tax reduction scheme, CTRS, task finish group to review the CTRS model in Hackney, the options and costs of the council to reduce the liability of council tax contributions for relevant working age adults, the cost implications to implement a zero-based CTRS model in Hackney. And the task finish group was open to all councillors who are members of an overview and scrutiny commission in the municipal year 2021 to 2022. We held 3 evidence sessions between September 2021 and February 2022. So I'm now going to just provide a verbal update on the key findings and proposed recommendations. We've also got some slides to try and sort of break it up a little bit. So thank you, Tracy. So the task group objectives were to review the CTRS model in Hackney, to understand the impact on eligible residents of contributing towards council tax, to review proposals to implement a zero-based CTRS model in Hackney and make recommendations. So going on to the next slide. So over 3 sessions, we had a number of contributors, both from inside and outside Hackney. So we heard from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, CPAG, the Local Citizens Advice Bureau, Deaf Plus, local charity Age UK in East London, London Borough of Lambeth, Camden, and also obviously officers from Hackney as well, about our existing models and proposals. So very brief, sort of broad brush background, but it's sort of quite important to sort of understand it. So the Local Government Finance Act established the council tax scheme to replace the old domestic rate system based on 2 adult households. And, you know, as Ian's already alluded to, the property valuations date back to 1991. There's a 25% discount for single adult households built in. So local authorities have a duty to review the rates annually, and a referendum is usually required for more than 2% rise. Some detail there. Council tax benefit, which was a means tested social security benefit paid for by government, was originally part of the scheme. This was changed in the Local Government and Finance Act 2012 and regulations, which in broad terms devolved council tax support to local authorities. So local authorities were given discretion to design their own council tax reduction schemes, CTRS with a legislative framework, or to choose a default scheme set out in regulations. The funding at the same time from central government to provide this support was reduced. We were only provided with 90% of the previous spend on council tax benefit. Legislation also required that eligible pensioners, people over state pension age, were given support, and it provided the facility to reduce the liability to zero for specified groups. That's a very, very broad brush. The next slide is just sort of included for information. I think it shows the council tax. I mean, there's some more detail in the finance report just been having, but just basically in broad terms, it shows the council tax I think it's just in England as a percentage of local government funding, and how we've become increasingly independent on that. Next slide, background. So yeah, so very, very quick counter through some of the really, really useful evidence we had as part of this task and finish group. So this is from the Child Poverty Action Group and the Institute of Fiscal Studies. So, they emphasised various different aspects of this. Low-income households brought into paying council tax the first time. The localisation has meant the minimum payment varies across local authorities. Some local authorities have zero contribution, and the average was asking people on low incomes to pay 20% of their council tax liability. So the introduction of this scheme coincided to the cuts to government funding for local authorities, also to benefits cuts, which impacted on the very, very same people who were being asked to pay these contributions to their council tax the first time, and wage freezes, and also that's now exacerbated by the additional pressures on cost of living. So just a couple of other factors. I'm going to try and be as quick as possible. So the council tax reduction scheme was originally considered with applications for housing benefit, but as the universal credit rolled out, this no longer happens. So the admin costs for local authorities of administering this increased. With many income changes, many residents' incomes fluctuate. If they're self-employed or they've got sort of uncertain incomes, zero hours contracts and so on. The impact of UC, and one of the factors that impacted on income fluctuation was the increase of universal credit during the pandemic, and then the subsequent decrease from September 2021. So the liability for individuals to pay this can change from month to month, producing uncertainty of their household incomes and also for the council. And then just to comment that sub-councils have introduced a banding scheme to simplify things and to smooth transitions. Go on to the next slide. So the next slide just really sort of sets out the CTRS caseloads by various boroughs. So you can see that we are very much at the upper end of that. In Hackney, we've got around 28,000, nearly 29,000 people claiming CTRS, and over 20,500 of those are in the working age category. Hackney scheme. So just in really, really broad terms, this is, I think one of the things we learned increasingly from this working group was that there's a lot of complexity to this. I think it's probably over 100 pages. The guidance has been published, something like that, 120 pages on the website. So I've just sort of tried to pull out a few of the sort of key features here. I mean, the principle decided on in Hackney was the cost was to be spread across all working age claimants. The original scheme, which was brought in, I think, in 2014, was 15% contribution. It rose to 17% in 2018, and then we reduced it again to 15% in 2020, obviously following consultation on all those occasions. And then we've got a taper income scheme at 20%. So there are some particular features in Hackney's scheme where decisions have been made really to sort of cater for the particular features of our residents in Hackney, our population. So there's a larger families deduction for 3 or more children. There's a set income disregard where the claimant's a single, a couple, or a lone parent. An earnings disregard of £17.10 when people work above 16 or 30 hours a week. Care leavers living in Hackney up to 25, age 25 are excluded. And then we've got a savings and capital limit of 16,000. Sorry, there's a lot of detail here. I'm just sort of racing through it. We haven't got a lot of time, but it was obviously a chance to ask questions. So I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail, but I mean, we heard evidence from comparable boroughs from Camden. So they've been operating a banded scheme. I mean, was the main feature of that, which sort of smoothed the transitions when people's incomes fluctuated. Although if you were on the cusp of a band, it could mean that you're on a cliff edge and would go into a higher payment rate. So it's applicable to working age applicants only. Pensioners remained in the default scheme, and there's high discounts given for families and disabled claimants. So, and they've got a disregard for childcare costs. So capitals and savings similar to Hackney, it's 16,000. So that was in Camden. Sorry, I know I'm going through this very fast, but we haven't got a lot of time. So CTRS in Lambeth, 20% liability reduction, 10,000 upper capital limit, so smaller than Hackney, 25% taper and £5 minimum payment, changes to non-dependent deductions. I mean, it's obviously very difficult to take in this sort of information, but having had a look in these schemes in more detail, there is a lot of significant difference really between the, different boroughs have made different trade-offs in relation to the different features of our different populations, and there isn't a huge amount of significant difference in, what individuals are paying. So, and then I've just really quickly gone through the CTRS in Tower Hamlets. It's got a lower capital threshold and less generous non-dependent deductions. So, and a minimum earnings floor equal to 35 hours at the national minimum wage is applied to applicants or residents who've been self-employed. So going on to the next slide. So the next slide sets out collection rates in Hackney, which I think is something people are probably going to be having questions about. So I'm not going to read out the figures, and then the next slide again is showing, we've got relatively high collection rates, but I know this is something where there may be further questions and more details. Go on to the next one. So, of the scheme is that councils had the ability to introduce an additional discretionary reduction to council tax. This is only available for people who are already in receipt of a council tax reduction and who are in financial hardship. It's a discretionary scheme with no statutory right to payment and short-term awards. Council tax discretionary fund will be cash limited, and councils cannot make cash awards and only credit the council tax account. During the period we were looking at in the task group, I think there was a very, very low rate out of the 100,000. I think around 6,000 had been distributed. I understand it's to do with challenges from the cyber attack. And I know that there's an update in relation to, which I'll let Jackie come in at the end in relation to that. So just going on to the evidence we heard from the local CAB. So, they gave some pretty compelling evidence about debt cases and financial pressures having increased on residents during the pandemic. 15% of cases they were dealing with in relation to debt had a council tax element. They emphasised the lack of knowledge and awareness that council tax benefits, for council tax benefit being a system that's administered separately by the council, universal credit being a system that's administered by DWP, and, you know, the amount of confusion that you know, can cause to people. And they had a pilot scheme working in collaboration with Hackney to support residents before the council acted on any debt, and they recommended that as something that's very helpful to residents. Then another local charity, Deaf Plus, most of their clients have disability or complex need. They've also suffered increased debt during the pandemic. They urged us in Hackney to disregard disability benefits and assessments for CTRS, and also highlighted an increase in domestic abuse, which subsequently leads to debt and hardship. Then Age UK, they've again been working to maximise claims pension credit to increase eligibility. They estimated that 4,500 additional households in Hackney could be claiming pension credit at the time we took this evidence. I don't know whether that's changed with the Money Hub. So, yeah, so here's a list really of the sort of key findings we had from the review. So the responsibility in broad terms is transferred to council with 10% cut to budget. The old council tax benefit scheme still applies to pensioners. The budget continues to reduce as residents move on to universal credit. The council used to rely on having access to information to assess housing benefits claims, and this is disappearing as housing costs are now included in universal credit. So councils have been given a certain amount of autonomy to design their own schemes, and therefore schemes differ across councils. Hackney Council has made the decision to exempt care leavers, which we all supported, I think continue to support. Hackney's council tax support scheme has been designed taking into consideration Hackney's population needs. Our caseload is significantly higher than other boroughs, and councils are urged not to apply the 2-child limit to their scheme. Contributions range up to 20%, and we're at the lower range, 15% at the moment. So, additional key findings: Institute of Fiscal Studies reported that working age households in England would have been entitled to support under the new council tax benefit system. We're now entitled to 24% less on average, which is really quite shocking. Child Poverty Action Group were not advocating for abandoning schemes because they created a cliff edge for families, but did support some features of Camden's boundary scheme. A key criticism was made about council tax support is complexity of schemes and many residents not being familiar with their scheme. The council tax support assessment involves complex variations. The slight change in income can require a new assessment. Cost of Hackney's CTRS is already higher than other boroughs due to the higher volume of cases. The income for council tax has become a more prominent feature of the income stream of councils, as we've been discussing a bit earlier. A cyber attack had impacted on the distribution of the hardship fund, but this was improving as the system was being restored. So we've already, circulated the recommendations, but I mean, they're in these broad areas in terms of, sort of communication and consultation, engagement with advice services, the quality of the equalities data, the, improvement of access and distribution of the hardship fund, the support for the Money Hub and advice support to residents, and continue with care leavers, and obviously an aspiration for if there's anything more that can be done in terms of care leavers who live outside the borough. So the next steps are the ambition of the council to provide low-income households with a 90% discount on the council tax bill by 2026 and a full discount by 2030. These proposals to be subject to consultation and eligibility will still be for claimants will still be subject to means testing. I mean, the conclusion of the task group was we obviously, having heard about the impact of these payments, and also the complexity and stress that adds to people's lives, was that we're obviously fully support the council's aspiration for a full discount. I mean, I think we all wished it would could come faster, but we understand the you know, the impact that will potentially have on council finances, and we've made some more detailed recommendations really on the existing administration of the scheme. So I think I'll stop, because it's been quite sort of canter through it. I don't know whether either Councillor Chapman or Ian and Jackie want to come in on any sort of update. I think I see Jackie reaching for her microphone.
Yeah, on the that you mentioned the council tax discretionary hardship scheme. So that was, and I think the take up was very low on that slide, but it was a few years ago now. As we set out in the slides earlier, the that scheme was topped up by 300,000 this year to 400,000 as at the end of January. The take up had been 324,000, so a lot different from what was sort of set out on the slides at the time. It's probably also worth mentioning that in January, Cabinet passed the exemption for foster carers as well. It's sort of foster carers in Hackney as well, which is obviously another sort of addition to the scheme since the review was undertaken.
Yeah, I don't know whether you want to really add anything about the sort of next stages in reductions and how that's going to be timetabled and panning out. So,
probably Ian could probably cover the timetable brought forward by somebody else in the directorate, but in terms of the financial planning for that's been factored into the medium-term financial plan, which is presented as part of the budget to go down to the 90% maximum payment from April 24.
Hello. Yeah. Can I just add? I think it's our intention to begin consultation on the next stage of the reduction in the spring, and as Jackie said, for full implementation in time for the 24-25 budget.
I mean, in terms of, I know people are probably going to have questions and comments. So in terms of the task group's report, that is still being finalised. So that's why we've got a summary. So it's going to be coming to the next scrutiny panel, the final decision and presentation. So, so are there any questions or comments? Councillor Joseph?
Oh, thank you, Chair. Yeah, just a proposal, I suppose, that for the lowest incomes, or the people on the lowest incomes, would we potentially consider lowering their contribution to 0% for those with a lower capital threshold? So essentially those on the lowest incomes that don't have any savings, because I noted that at £16,000 the threshold was quite high, so you can have £16,000 of savings and still receive an element of council tax reduction. But if we wanted to help, you know, the most sort of desperate people, then possibly we could look at the people on the lowest incomes with a lower amount of savings. I think some other boroughs use £6,000 as their threshold. And I just thought that that group is probably the most in need, and possibly we could try to help them a little bit sooner. That was just my thoughts.
Thank you. I think I'll probably pass over to Ian and Jackie for comments on that. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Councillor Joseph. Just so I understood it correctly, I think if someone was on less, had savings of under 16,000, then that wouldn't have an impact on them in terms of the not being eligible, if you see what I mean, for reduction schemes. So unless I slightly misheard the question, but what we can do, and obviously we'll be coming out to consult in the spring on a new scheme, not just the reduction of the 10% position, but also just the variables that sit beneath it. I think if you recall that the various sort of deep dives that the scrutiny panel did, we looked at all the underlying factors that can drive it. So I think we saw, didn't we, a presentation from colleagues at Lambeth who, in headline terms, made noises as though their scheme was effectively far more generous than ours. But if you recall from the presentations we saw, when we applied their scheme to some of our cohorts, they would actually have been worse off. So I do think it's always, the devil's always in the detail in all of these things, but we'll settle that out in the consultation document when we bring that forward in the spring.
And I think the underlying point of Councillor Joseph's question really was about, is it possible to give more substantial help, forgive me if I'm paraphrasing, to the poorest residents sooner in terms of this liability within the scheme? Is that a fair summary, Councillor Joseph?
Yes, it is. Sorry, I didn't be coherent, but that is what I was saying.
We can certainly look at that as part of the consultation and work through what I wouldn't want to do this evening is say something absolutely as possible but lead to an unintended consequence of that, but we'll certainly look at it in the consultation and come forwards. And of course, like any consultation, as we've seen before, people are able to come back and say, have we thought of doing X and Y? I think on the previous update to the scheme, we brought in a range of sort of support for groups that hadn't previously been included, and I'm sure there'll be things that come out of the consultation this time that we'll look to bring in.
Councillor Chapman?
Yeah, and I would just say, I mean, it's my understanding that the involvement of the members of the council and obviously this commission, given all the work, particularly given all the work it's just done on council tax reduction scheme, would be, a major part of the consultation. So I think I stand to be contradicted by the director, but I'm sure we could bring back quite a lot of this in detail, for you to consider as we're going through the implementation of the new scheme. Or sorry, the consultation on the new scheme prior to implementation.
That's what we've done previously. I don't see any reason why I wouldn't do that again.
Do we have any more questions or comments on the CTRS task group? No, thank you very much. So, we're now moving on to agenda item 7, which is the minutes of the previous meeting. So these are in agenda pages 109 to 120. Are we able to agree? Yeah. Any matters arising? No. Okay. So just really briefly, agenda item 8 is the work programme, page 123 to 126. As I mentioned at the beginning, sorry, Councillor Chapman, did you want to come in now or?
Sorry, just I forgot to say that thank both you and the Commission for all the work you've done on the CTRS scheme and the presentation you've just made, and it's been really helpful. I apologise, I forgot to add that in, but it is a really important bit of work and it's been really helpful. Thank you.
Try to look in now.
Hello.
Yeah, you're back now. No, we just disappeared.
Okay. All right. Really briefly, work programme. So the Mayor was not able to attend his question time, so had to reschedule it for July, which is the first meeting of next municipal year. So sorry, Councillor Chapman, we just totally lost sound when you were just in full flow. So.
Oh, I was passing on my thanks for all the work that you've done on the CTRS review up to now on that presentation, and it's been very helpul. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks to the officers and everyone who supported it. So, okay, so the session in April for poverty reduction is currently being scoped with officers. I think if members have got any suggestions for the session, please get in touch. A couple of people have already. And then just finally, one of the areas we're looking to develop is finance and budget scrutiny, and been looking for budget scrutiny reporting in other boroughs. And we'd like the Scrutiny Panel to review how we participate in the budget setting process. One of the first areas under consideration is going to be additional training. If anyone's got suggestions, get in contact with us for that. So, okay. Any comments or questions on Scrutiny Panel work programme? Councillor Potter.
Sorry, given the in-depth work we did last year on, you know, climate and the cross-cutting work, would it be possible at least to have an item where we had a bit of an update or on a very broad brush sense? So we need to at least have it as an annual item.
You hear Tracy's response to it, yeah.
We're hoping, well, we're drafting the report now, bringing all of that work together to give you the headlines. So we'll hopefully do that for the next meeting in April.
Yeah. And possibly a more substantial meeting, but it would have to go on until next year. So, anything else? No. I declare the meeting closed. Thank you everybody. Didn't go on to,